Geology students, I'm making this one short video this week to get you introduced to chapter number 7, and it's about evolution, the theory, and its supporting evidence. Um, you're going to watch a film about Charles Darwin and his life and his theory of biological evolution through natural selection. First thing I'd like to state about this is evolution means change with time. Everything changes with time. You're not the same person you were 5 years ago. You'll be a different person 5 years from now. Our country was different 100 years ago. 100 years ago, it was 1921, and World War I veterans were on strike. Calvin Coolidge was the president, and the horseless carriage, the automobile, was starting to become more popular. Things change with time, and it's nature. Nature changes with time as well. Species change with time, and sometimes they change so much they can make new species. People um, tend to misinterpret what Charles Darwin said, or to make political hay out of what Charles Darwin said. What Darwin said was that nature selects who gets to survive and pass on their genetic information. Darwin didn't know about DNA, but favorable traits get passed on, is what Darwin said. And that has to occur if you think about it. Think about giraffes. In the distant past, some giraffes had long necks, some had short necks, and some had medium-sized necks. And there was a drought, and the leaves were high up on the trees. Who died, and who survived? Well, the giraffes that had long necks could reach the leaves, and therefore the next generation of giraffes ended up having long necks. Whatever is an advantage, that gives an individual a higher chance of surviving in the natural world, is going to pass on their genetic information. Now we know that it's passed on through DNA. There is no controversy about evolution among scientists. Um, and as a Christian, I can tell you that um, most Christians believe that God could have created evolution so his creations could survive. It doesn't. Darwin himself was not an atheist. He believed in a creator. So just because you believe in evolution does not mean you don't believe in God. It's a straw man. Evolution neither proves nor disproves the existence of a creator. All it says is that those individuals who have advantages that allow for them to survive will pass those on to the next generation. Why do rhinoceros have these large horns? Well, think about it. When lions and hyenas are attacking rhinoceros, who has a higher chance of surviving an attack? A rhinoceros without a method for defending itself, or one with a large horn? So nature selects those traits that give that individual a higher chance for survival and passes it on to the next generation. And it also has to do with sexual selection, which we need to talk about as well. Because there's a second part to Darwin's theory of evolution, and it has to do with sexual selection. So we can add on to what Darwin said at the beginning and then look at what he said towards the end. Individuals who have attributes that allow for them to survive the to the age of sexual maturity, attract someone of the opposite sex, and produce fertile offspring are those who pass on their DNA or their genetic traits. That's what evolution is today. And if you look at it, you can see in the natural world, you can see this. For example, um, peacocks. Why do male peacocks have this display? To I'm sure you've seen male peacocks have this beautiful display. That's for attracting females. So part of the evolution of a species is also the passing down of traits that makes one more desirable to the opposite sex. That has to be part of evolution as well. For example, if you were a male peacock with a very sparse, a very little, small number of feathers that weren't very colorful, you might be less likely to attract a female. Or let's take a look at male cardinals. Why do they have this bright red coloration? It's to attract females. And so the theory of evolution basically states through natural selection that those individuals who have the attributes that allow for them to survive to the age of sexual maturity, attract the opposite sex, and produce fertile offspring, they pass on their traits to the next generation. In a nutshell, that's Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection. And so species change, and sometimes species change so much that they become new species. And that's what Darwin was talking about. It has nothing to do with whether or not there's a creator or not. I happen to believe there is, but what it has to do with is modern biology. And it's why our antibiotics no longer work. Penicillin used to be 99% effective in killing various viruses. Now it's less than 50%. Why? Or various germs, I should say. Why? Because think about it. If you have 1,000,000 bacteria and 990,000 of those bacteria will get killed by the penicillin, which bacteria pass on their DNA to the next generation? Those bacteria with a resistance to penicillin. So every time we develop antibiotics, eventually the bacteria are going to develop an immunity to our antibiotics. That's why we have to keep developing new antibiotics. Insecticides, the same thing. DDT used to be used to kill mosquitoes. It was almost 98% effective. Now it's less than 50% effective. Why? If you have 1,000,000 mosquitoes and 1,000 of them can survive DDT, then the next generation of mosquitoes is going to be have a resistance to DDT. So it's how modern medicine works. It explains how species evolve and how you can have species evolve into new species when their DNA is significantly different. It's important to note that Darwin did not understand what DNA was, because that wasn't developed until the 20th century when Watson and Crick discovered DNA. Now we know that genetic traits are passed on through DNA. But Darwin, to his credit, figured out that species evolve from those attributes within individuals who have that give them a higher likelihood of surviving in the natural world to the age of sexual maturity, where they can attract the opposite sex and produce fertile offspring. Here's a picture of Charles Darwin, and in the video you're going to watch this week, please watch it carefully, and we'll talk more about how he came up with his theory of evolution through natural selection. But before we do, let me just show you talk about Lamarck versus Darwin. And let's take a look at giraffes, for example. So there was another scientist who came before Darwin, and he thought that species evolved through their life activities, things that they do throughout their life. And Darwin showed that no, that's not why species evolve. Species evolve because those individuals who have advantages pass on those traits to the next generation. So let's compare the two. Lamarck said species evolve because of their life activities. So he said that, for example, giraffes, as if the leaves were high on the trees, then they have to stretch and stretch their neck until their ligaments were lengthened. And over time, the giraffes would develop longer and longer necks to reach the leaves. And these longer necks would be passed on to the next generation. We now know this is nonsense. What really is happening is giraffes, some of them have long necks, some have short necks, some have medium-sized necks. Sexual reproduction, which we're going to talk about, produces variety. So you have individuals with long necks, medium necks, and short length necks. And then when the leaves were high on the trees, only those giraffes with long necks could eat. The others died of starvation. Therefore, the next generation of giraffes would have long necks. It's not through stretching your neck. It's only individuals who have the long neck in the first place get to survive and pass on their genetic information. That's the difference. And just to give you an example how Lamarckian evolution does not work, Lamarckian evolution is back in the 1940s. In the old Soviet Union, there was there was a dictator by the name of Stalin, and Stalin wanted to increase the grain harvest for the Soviet Union, and he hired a man named Andrei Lysenko, Lysenko, as his Minister of Agriculture to increase the amount of grain that could be grown within the Soviet Union. And what he did was they took wheat seeds and put them in freezers and exposed them to the lowest possible temperature possible, where they would not die, where they could still germinate. And they would plant these seeds, and they were using Lamarckian evolution as their theory. That they thought that the seeds that had been exposed to extreme cold developed a resistance to cold, and that would get passed on. That's Lamarckian theory. And Lysenko believed in Lamarckian evolution. It didn't work. The next generation of wheat seeds had the same resistance to cold. And this theory also led to mass starvation in the Soviet Union. So it shows you two things. One is that Lamarck was wrong and Darwin was right. And it also shows you communism doesn't work very well, does it? I mean, to be honest. Anyway, there's a young Charles Darwin, and his voyages throughout the world marked by these red arrows, with Captain Fitzroy aboard the HMS Beagle. HMS is a term that's used for British ships, His Majesty's servant. His HMS Beagle, captained by Captain Fitzroy, and with Charles Darwin, explored the world. And during that voyage, and also after the voyage, when he was back in England, he came up with his theory of evolution through natural selection, which we're going to talk about a lot next week. Watch the video carefully, and next week we'll talk about this more.